amazing Jack London scholar, and this is Jay Williams, who's also an amazing Jack London scholar. I'll let them just briefly introduce themselves and tell the class a little bit, just really, really briefly, why you're a Jack London scholar, what you do, what you study about Jack London, and then the floor is yours. Take it all away. Thank you for coming. Let's give them a round of applause again.
Okay, I'm Susan, and I found myself in graduate school, UMass Amherst, in literature, because I did not major in it as an undergraduate, and I thought, I want to understand why great literature is great. And then they gave me a class to teach. That was a lot of fun, so I had to pick a dissertation topic, and I thought, how about Jack London? And my advisors all said, oh great, it'll be interesting to see what you come up with, because he wasn't very well taught at the university. And he was considered a popular writer because he made so much money and was so successful, or a hack writer because he wrote so much, because he was so disciplined. And then from there, I got a job and kept on doing research, and when I retired in 2011, I moved to Santa Rosa, and where I met Iris, and now we are working on a biography of Jack's second life, Charmian London, as I'm sure you've heard about.
I'm Jay. I'm managing editor of Critical Inquiry at the University of Chicago. Critical Inquiry is a theory journal published by University of Chicago Press. I've worked there for way too many years, and I'm ready to retire, like Susan, to Sonoma or Petaluma, something that looks like that. I did my dissertation on Jack London as well. I did a critical edition of The Star Rover, which is London's penultimate novel. Wrote it in 1913, 1914. I got interested in London in graduate school. I took a seminar in American Literary Realism and Naturalism, and the book that we read by London was Martin Eden. I had never read any Jack London before that, and I was entranced, and everyone else in the class was appalled, and I thought, well, I'll show them. I'll prove to them that Jack London's a great writer, or this is worthy of discussion or research. But also I was interested in London because of this vast archive that he has at the Huntington Library in Los Angeles, or outside of Los Angeles. And I was very interested in reading primary documents, looking at manuscripts and letters and diaries and that kind of thing. And there's just, he never threw anything away. So, nor did his wife, his second wife. So it afforded me plenty of opportunity to dredge stuff up and analyze it. And then, since then, I've been involved in various Jack London projects, including editing and publishing the Jack London Journal for a number of years, and then after my kid left and went to school, I was able to get down to some serious writing and completed the first volume of the Jack London biography called Author Under Sale, and I've completed the second volume, and the third volume is in the near future, I hope, maybe after retirement. So anyway, that's my story. You want to start?
Well,
I'll start.
yeah.
Okay. There are a lot of different things to talk about with Call of the Wild, so I better watch the time pretty carefully. Should we each take?
Almost minutes.
Sorry.
About 20 minutes each.
Take 20 minutes? Okay, good. 11:25. Okay, so that would give me time to talk about two things. One is the composition of the book, and the other thing is the first sentence and the final, certain words in the final chapter, which I think are really important and tie into the first sentence of the book. So the composition history. Jack London started the novel on December 1st, 1902. The work that he previous to that was a very obscure newspaper article about the planting of the cornerstone of the mining building at the University of California, Berkeley, which was paid for by the Hearst family. William Randolph Hearst the first built this mining building to celebrate California's role in mining gold and other valuable minerals. And I don't know if we'll ever find out how Jack London got that assignment to do that. He had worked for the Hearst paper before that. And so he had just returned from England to do a book on the poor of the East End, which is the poorest section of London, was the poorest section of London at the time. And he wrote a book called The People of the Abyss, sociological study of the causes and cures of poverty in England. And he had just come back in November to do that, so he probably went to the Hearst newspaper office and said, give me an assignment, and they said, go do this. And so in the middle of a rainstorm, he stood there with an umbrella with everyone else and watched Hearst's wife, Phoebe, dedicate the building. So two things are important about that moment. One is that it's all about mining. London had, obviously, you all know, he mined for gold and tried to strike it rich in the Klondike in 1897, 1898, so about 4 years previous to that. And he was endlessly fascinated, not just by mining, but by any way to work the earth, and that shows up later in his career as well, right? As a farmer here in Sonoma County. So there's a continuity there of London's interest in the work, in the land. It wasn't just about finding gold, it was about how to make the land respond to the human touch, we might say poetically. The other thing that's key about this writing of the article, newspaper article, is that it was a newspaper, that he worked for a newspaper. The newspaper world in California was incredibly important to him as a writer. He conceived of an author as somebody who could use newspaper articles as a basis or a foundation or an inspiration for his fiction. So when you look in his archive, right, you'll find just tons and tons of newspaper articles. So he wanted to write an article or a novel called The Persistence of the Established, which was supposed to be an attack on what we would call the 1% today, right? The established being, those people who have the money and are gonna keep it, right, no matter what. So when you look at his notes for that, they're just tons and tons of articles about which he read, cut, labeled Persistence of the Established, and then filed away. So he had all these files of newspaper articles. And that then would provide him as a starting point. How do you write a novel? Well, he thought he'd start with collecting newspaper articles and then kind of get an inspiration, get an idea of plot, character, and dynamic from the newspaper world, and then let your creative imagination turn it into fiction. It's one of the predominant methods of writing that he used. There were other ways that he wrote. And interestingly enough, Call of the Wild, as far as we can tell, is based on absolutely nothing. It's at a time when you would think you could find notes or articles that he would have clipped. 1902 is fairly late in Jack London's career, even though he wrote for another 14 years. But still, so you would think that you would find stuff, and there's nothing there. It's just, we don't even have the manuscript or the typescript. It's just the published book. That's all there is, and letters. So what's interesting about the composition process, so he started it, as I said, on December 1st, 1902, and he finished on January 27th, 1903. So that's like all of December, and then most of January, except for a couple of days, so it's almost 2 months. And so you can do the math, you can count the number of words in the novel. And so he was writing about 670 words a day. If you have to subtract a week out, because apparently he dropped a box on his foot or something, and he was laid up in bed, and apparently he didn't write that entire week, which was odd for Jack to go a whole week without writing anything. But anyway, he started writing, and in December, and he had just signed a contract with a publisher, one of the biggest publishers in America, Macmillan Company, and the publisher's name was George Brett, B-R-E-T-T. And in November, when he was coming back from London, he met with Brett in New York, and they talked about this and that, and then Jack probably borrowed some money from him and borrowed cigarettes, and then, and they talked about what his plans were going to be as a writer. And then when he got back, he wrote a very long letter to George Brett and said, okay, here are the 6 things that I'm going to write for you. Because he wanted to try to convince Brett to give him a contract, like a multi-year contract or something along those lines. Something that would give him a monthly income so that he could write his book. And in order to convince Brett, he thought, if I tell him that I'm gonna write a whole bunch of shit, then he's really gonna like me, right? So I'm gonna write a novel called The Flight of the Duchess. And I've got 2 volumes of short stories on the Klondike. And I've got this other novel in mind. And I've got another novel, and I've got another novel in mind, And Brett's like, whoa, that's great. Here's the contract, But think smaller, Jack, one thing at a time, right? So you would think that Jack had, and he tells him in the letter, so Flight of the Duchess is gonna be about this, and so he's kind of clear idea about several of these books, right? So December 1st, he sits down, you would think he would sit down and start writing Flight of the Duchess, or one of these stories that finished the Klondike collection, something that Brett had said would be under contract, would be in contract. Write this stuff and you'll get your money, right? And what does Jack do? He sits down and writes whatever the fuck he wants, right? He writes Call of the Wild. Not under contract. He hadn't told Brett about a single word about it. And in fact, for the rest of the 2 months, the whole time that he's writing Call of the Wild, even when he knows this is turning out to be pretty great, this is turning out to be a really good book, he doesn't say a word. In fact, he lies to George. And he's like, yeah, I'm writing this thing, I don't want to tell you about it, And so, and Brett actually comes to see him in January, first week of January. And Jack's got like 20,000 words done. And he doesn't show it to him. You would think he would show it to him, right? It's like, hey, I'm doing, great. And it's like, didn't tell him about it. So that's a big question. Why not? Why doesn't, and we're talking about a young author. We're talking about a guy who's pretty much written only 1 novel at this point. He's done 4 collections of short stories, but he's only done 1 novel. This is his 2nd novel, basically, right? So I don't know. It's something to speculate about. It's very telling about an author who has that kind of relationship with his publisher. He finishes the book, and he sends it to Brett, and he says, here's a short story that got away from me and became a novel. I hope you like it. Which is a complete lie, right? It didn't start out as a short story, and it became a novel. You can tell, and it's one of the things you probably should look at when you reread the book, you can tell that it starts out as a novel and keeps going as a novel. There's no point where it's like, oh, this short story should become a novel. Let's fix this structure, right? No, it starts out very much like this is going to be a full-fledged, long narrative. This is not going to be a short narrative, right? So you kind of read the first chapter and look at the points where he's like setting up the narrative so that it will continue for another 4 or 5 chapters, right? All right, so that brings us to the first sentence, which is?
Buck didn't read the paper.
Buck did not read the newspaper, right? Or else he would have known that his life was going to change in a radical way, right? So, when I was in 7th grade, computers were like, you know, these weird things that they had learned how to imitate the human voice. And so I remember sitting in 7th grade science class and hearing a computer say a human sentence, like for the first time. And the sentence was, I'll never forget this, I like my coffee black. and I do, here it is. So. But then they could make it, they could manipulate the voice so it would emphasize different words in the sentence. I like my coffee black. I like my coffee. I like my coffee black. So if you perform the same experiment on the first sentence, you get different ways to approach the novel. Buck did not read the newspapers. And if you emphasize the first word, then it becomes a story about Buck and a dog. Buck the dog, right? Buck did not read the newspapers. Oh, he wrote for the newspapers. Is that what that means? He didn't write for the newspapers. He didn't read the newspapers. He wrote for the newspapers. Remember, at this point, all of you guys, even before you read the book, probably knew that Buck was a dog, right? So you have to take yourself back to 1903 and remember the audience for this book did not know that the first word book, Buck, meant book, Buck. Yeah. It did not know that Buck was a dog. It could be a person, right? So Buck did not read the newspapers. Did that mean he couldn't read? Didn't mean that he read novels, that he read short stories? Is that what's going to come after this independent clause, right? If you emphasize the word newspapers, then it becomes a different sort of book, right? Buck did not read the newspapers. He read novels, or he read something else, right? It's a very odd sort of sentence, but it's actually a very great sentence because it's like reader interaction, right? If you choose to emphasize this word, you go in that direction. If you choose, and which one is right? Well, I'm not saying. But if you look at the ending of the book, you kind of get a sense of what London's up to here, right? So, in my little thing, in the sounding of the call, let's see. It's hard to say where exactly this is. 1, 2, 3, 4, counting backwards from the end of the book. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11th. I think the 11th, oh no, before that, sorry. It's where he's killing the moose, right? And he's killing the moose. It's like the 13th paragraph from the end. And he finally kills the moose. And as he's waiting, just before the moment that he kills the moose, right? It says in the middle of the paragraph, as the moose were coming into the land, other kinds of life were coming in. Forest and stream and air seemed palpitant with their presence. The news of it was borne in upon him. Now you just, in fact, I just reread this ending this morning or last night or sometime, and I totally missed this. But the word news, if you connect it to the beginning, to the first sentence, that's incredibly important. That's not just a happenstance and a happy accident of London choosing that word. That's a deliberate choice. So the news that Buck reads is the news that is sent to him by nature. Buck doesn't read newspapers, he reads nature. And that makes sense. That's what a dog does, right? And I know one of the big questions that's asked about Call of the Wild is Buck an allegorical figure? Does he function in the book in the way that the white whale of Moby Dick functions, or the Scarlet Letter? Is it an allegorical figure, or is it a realistic treatment of a dog? If you read it in this way, a dog reading nature, then it's very clearly a book about a dog and nothing else, right? Okay, so The birds talked of it, the squirrels chattered about it, the very breeze whispered of it. Several times he stopped and drew in the fresh morning air in great sniffs, reading a message which made him leap on with greater speed. So for me, that cinches it. You know, here's London talking about a figure who reads nature. Nature is a newspaper for dogs. It gives them, the dog, a sense of immediacy, foretells the future. And so as he's trotting back to Thornton's camp, he knows exactly something's wrong, something's happened, because he's read it in his doggy paper, you know. So, well, I have a lot more to
So
say.
now we know
about it.
how you read the first sentence.
Sorry.
So now we know how you read the first sentence.
Yes and no. Because I do think, in some way, Buck functions as an allegorical figure. And I only have a couple minutes to talk about this, but the way that I conceive, I've talked about London's relationship to his publisher. Then you also think about the relationship of an author to his imagination, to his imagining self, to his source of inspiration. And what is that relationship for London? And very simply put, for London, the imagination was a ghost. It was something frightful, but something you tried to tame. And that's what Buck, I think, becomes. Is this book about Buck is really about an author and his relationship to the imagination. And so Buck, of course, goes through this narrative of evolution and de-evolution. It becomes, it starts out as an economic figure. He's the king of the valley. He becomes a work beast. At the end, he's freed from the economic sphere, becomes an economic figure, right? And so, just as the imagination is freed of any kind of economic constraints, and as we saw, the writing of Call of the Wild was not done under contract. It was not done for money. It was done simply from a source of inspiration, and that's what Buck is for Jack. He's this terrifying wolf-like creature that seizes him and makes him write against his will.
Sorry, quick question. Do you think the allegorical aspect of Call of the Wild isn't completely intentional or partially? Or?
Completely intentional.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
He denied it though.
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
Jack is one of the biggest liars you'll ever meet. With bar none, he lied about everything. And we saw that when I talked about how he related to Brett. And, you know, the next thing that he wrote about was getting into print, another one of his essays about how to become a writer. And he wrote several of these essays about, you know, telling young people how to break into the trade. Don't write a sad story. All of Jack's fiction is sad. It's terribly awful. Don't write. The American public wants a happy ending. You know, people get married, they meet, they get married. Martin Eden, he gets, he married, you know, he meets a lovely woman, that falls apart. He writes, that falls apart. In the end, he kills himself, you know.
He ruined it for you. That's not Call of the Wild. That's Martin Eden.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So, Call of the Wild, is that a happy ending?
They haven't finished.
Oh.
Oops.
But no, don't worry, don't
Okay,
worry.
sorry.
They're afraid Buck's gonna die.
Oh,
They love
so you
Buck.
really identify and sympathize with
Don't
the dog.
deny, I'm more confirmed.
Just don't talk about it.
They're really into it, yeah.
Oh,
To me, when I'm reading the story about Buck, I identified him with the life of Pi. Almost like Jack London is referring to Buck as almost and the pack of dogs like people, and where the audiences can't really see people acting in savage ways,
oh, I see.
and like the animals are kind of representation of that. Is that even close to how the story?
So you prefer more of the allegorical reading?
Right,
Animals
right.
stand in for humans because we can't really understand humans without first processing a
Right.
more simple, organic
Right.
unit, yeah. Totally valid way to approach it, absolutely. But be careful, because he does show humans acting as repulsively and violently as humans could ever do. I mean, that's the first thing really that you learn about Buck and humans, right?
Right.
Or the first thing he learns about humans is they have clubs,
Right.
and they'll just
And then
smash
the
the
sweater.
living out
Yeah.
of it. Sad.
Yeah, let me grab your thing.
Okay.
So we'll have time for more questions, so keep coming, these are great questions.
There's a PowerPoint on it.
Okay, I'll get it.
Hold on one. Alright, so what I wanna show you are some, I have a PowerPoint presentation, and there are lobby cards. And this has to do with the popularity of Call of the Wild and early movies that were made. And it turns out that Sonoma State University has a special collections and with a Jack London collection. And someone had collected these old lobby cards, which were all hand painted and
That one?
Okay.
Hollywood?
Yep.
Hollywood Colorado?
yep. Says that.
Cow,
Huh?
Cow.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
See, call it wild.
not D-O-G, C-O-W.
Okay, now get the,
What's a lobby card?
oh, in the lobby, when you go into a cinema, you know, you see those big posters, you know, for movies that have been there or that are coming. They didn't used to be that giant. Oh, so I'll just tell you when to switch them,
Yeah.
huh? Okay.
I'll
so-
be your assistant.
Yeah, so we go right on to the next one. And this is just a picture of Jack when he was 8 or 9 with his dog. And part of the popularity of Call of the Wild is that it's connected with this back to nature movement that's was in full swing during Roosevelt's presidential years, which was 1901 to 1909. And the movement has several characteristics. One is environmental groups, such as the Audubon Society and the Sierra Club were formed then. Nature study in the public schools was started. An animal welfare movement was begun. And in literature, there was a new school of sentimental nature writers, including John Muir, William Long, Ernest Thompson Seton, John Burroughs, among others. And the new school of nature writers wanted to refute the darker implications of Darwinism, okay? Which held that human beings and animals were closely related, and that nature is red in tooth and claw. That was their favorite expression, right? And so what these writers wanted to do was to downplay the cruelty of nature and depict animals whose behavior was not strictly dictated by instinct, okay, but the animals had, and you'll see Buck, moral perceptions, individuality, and intelligence. All right, so the animals in the stories appear to be real characters with distinct personalities, and the narratives reflect the animal's point of view, which is what Jack does. The stories were usually based on the writer's personal observations. But as Jay mentioned, Jack did a ton of research. I mean, he knew how long a wolf gestated, how many pups they had. I mean, everything. He knew everything to make it seem realistic.
No, we were talking actually, you mentioned it that she was researching the type of breed that Buck is, and that his breed specifically is an intelligent type of breed.
It
That-
isn't?
It is.
It is?
It is, yeah.
Okay, good. So in the new sentimental version of nature, the wild is inhabited not by beasts, but by animals with human virtues, such as courage, endurance, leadership, loyalty, and the ability to love. And because the animals were shown to be intelligent and as unique individuals, sentimental readers could project their own perceptions and anxieties onto these animals. Let's see. Jack, of course, is, kind of going against the grain on this whole thing. Yeah, one of the writers who writes about this movement in literature said nearly every issue of most popular magazines featured at least one animal story or essay every month. And she said that it was so prevalent, had this genre become, that it received unlimited space in the Sunday, magazines and the monthlies. So these were very popular. So the next one is Jack in his Klondike garb, and this was a photo that ran in Overland Monthly magazine in 1899 to help promote his Yukon stories. And his stories appeared in Overland Monthly, McClure's, Youth's Companion, and surprisingly, his first 4 books were collections of stories. All right, they contained 38 stories altogether, and only one of them was a dog story. Even though now he's known as a dog writer, writes dog stories, but and the one story that was included was called Bâtard, which is French word for bastard, and it's about this dog who knocks his boss, who's been mistreating him, gets somehow on a stand. Have they read it?
They haven't read it, but it's in our textbook if you wanna read it.
Okay, and has a noose around his neck, and the dog sees his chance and dives and knocks the crate out from under him, so he hangs. And so this is, animal as violent. This is against the grain of this new sentimental literature. And so London has a story that he spread around. Well, this is one of his great lies, all right? But you'll see it everywhere. We read about Called White. He said that that he had been unhappy with his treatment of the dog in the story Bâtard. And that's why he wanted to write another story and show the dog in a better light. And that was, and the other thing, at the end of the book that he wrote when he was in England, in the slums, the worst slums in England, which was the most successful, largest empire in the world at the time, where you would think everyone was living really well, a totally high quality of life. And in the slum, it was awful. I mean, there were homeless people, and it was just awful. He was appalled, and he was from the slums in Oakland. And so when he came back, or at the end of that book, he said, there in the heart of the wealthiest empire in the world, he found wretched masses of men, women, and children struggling to survive amidst chronic hunger, disease, and homelessness. He observed in the book, People do this, if this be civilization, then give me naked and howling savagery. And so he did do a couple of other, nonfiction newspaper things, but then the next book that he wrote was called what? So now, this is what the first edition, when he published it, this is the cover. And going back to the story that he told his publisher, Brett, that, he said this in a letter to Anna Strunsky, that the story got away from me. And instead of writing another story, instead of 4,000 words, it ran to 32,000 words before I could call a halt. So one has to ask, I think, why did it get away from him? Did he seek to counter his pessimistic view of civilized life in the East End with a positive view of wildlife and nature? Did he desire to show that the cruel law of nature, which is eat or be eaten, appeared, in his estimation, to be more just and less cruel than the injustice perpetuated within civilization? where the prosperity of a few is balanced by the chronic starvation and misery of the many. So let's go on to the next one. So this is one of the earliest lobby cards for Call of the Wild, produced by Hal Roach Studios in 1923. So this is a silent and a black and white movie. But to illustrate it, to get people to want to pay money to go see it, they had these cards to advertise it, which were hand painted and very colorful. But we have a whole set from this movie. The movie, I think, has disappeared. But we have these lobby cards which depict the key scenes. And you'll see it's interesting. Let's see. This card represents the last chapter, the sounding of the call. Okay. So the next one is and the dog pack laughed. So you have to wonder. And it turns out that sometimes the men in the advertising department, who selected the images for the cards, had not seen the film. All right, so they have some bizarre selections, and I think and the dog pack laughed. I don't know that they laughed. So we go on to the next one. In this one, the caption reads, "Track and trail spared no one."
What's your favorite scene? Movies.
Yeah, from a plot summary that's posted online at MSN Entertainment, we get of this plot summary. Buck, the Saint Bernard, gets top billing in this adaptation of the novel by Jack London, and he earns it. His performance eclipsed that of such well-known actors as Jack Mulhall and Walter Long. And after Call of the Wild, but at the same time, there's some other really famous dogs that were tremendously popular. Rin Tin Tin, who was actually before Buck.
German Shepherd?
Was Rin Tin Tin a German Shepherd?
There's one really famous.
Maybe that was Rin Tin Tin. I think so.
Like broke his leg.
Oh yeah. Oh, it went on for a long time. And then after that, of course, was Lassie, who was, and it's the same genre. So, the next one is When Buck Was a Puppy. So this is he's a Christmas gift to a group of children. But after growing up in a loving home, he is stolen and sold as a sled dog in the Klondike. We can go on to the next one. I'll just read mostly the captions. So this one, the caption is, well, let me ask you, what do you think? What would you call it? Man and dog, partners.
Well, they have the captions right below.
Is that it right there?
That's it right
Yeah,
there.
good eyesight. Partners, yeah. Let's see, the next one is Buck senses the challenge. And this is supposed to be the El Dorado Saloon. And I think that's it for that one series. So this next one, if we go to the next slide, we're gonna jump ahead 12 years to 1935. And this is not at all faithful to London's story. But this is, of course, Clark Gable and Loretta Young, right? And Buck is noticeably absent in most of these cards. And Jack Oakey, if you see the movie, steals the whole show. So let's see, the 35 movies featured not the canine hero Buck, but Hollywood stars. 34-year-old Clark Gable as Jack Thornton, 22-year-old Loretta Young as Claire Blake. Now, go figure, that's complete creation, there's no,
No Claire Blake.
there's no Claire Blake in the book. And then 32-year-old Jack Oakey as Shorty Houlihan. And you know, they filmed this in Mount Baker in northern Washington. And of course, they were stranded there by a blizzard. The worst blizzard in 20 years. And so even though they were forced to wait out the weather, Gable and Young fell in love with each other, right? And he was married, she was not. Young announced her retirement after filming this movie and went to Paris. When she returned in 1937 with a 23-month-old baby she claimed to have adopted, although this was Clark Gable's daughter from their love affair. And so we can go on to the next one. There was, she wrote, Loretta Young wrote, or no, her daughter wrote a book. Wasn't that Mommy Dearest? And it turns out Loretta Young wanted to have her ears, an ear job done because they stuck out, and she thought everybody would know she was Clark Gable's daughter, but she wanted to flatten her ears. Yeah, it's bizarre. The script writers, Gene Fowler and Leonard Praskins, specified that a German Shepherd played Buck. But director William Wellman thought the Shepherd looked too small next to Clark Gable, so he used a Saint Bernard instead. And the movie downplayed the violence of life and death in the wild and exalts, can you guess, the steamy romance between Gable and Young on the screen. So the next one. Yes. The Hollywood version completely skips over the first chapter into the primitive and opens in the Yukon. Here we see, this is John Thornton in a Skagway saloon. Going to the next one is Thornton teams up with Shorty Houlihan, that's Jack Oakey, who has stolen Old Man Blake's map to a gold claim. Okay. It's not accurate at all. But let's go on to the next one. There we go. And if you watch, sometimes his shirt and tie will be in different colors because different people were painting them in, and they didn't know if it was green or red or blue, and so it switches around in these.
Let me just insert that you can find this online for free on YouTube. The whole Call of Wild with Clark Gable.
Oh, okay.
It's on. I found it the other day. It's
Super.
totally free.
It's a great watch, even though it's not accurate. So they buy Buck, who is crated in meat. However, Thornton tames Buck in a matter of minutes with food and gloves. There's no beating by the man in the red sweater. So the next one is, along with the dog, most of London's important scenes are left out. There is no nightmarish first day on Daiya Beach, no Spitz, Billy, Dave, or Solex, and Buck is no devil. No dogs die, no men are killed, except for 3 bad guys who drown when their canoe capsizes. There are no yeehaws, and John Thornton is alive and well at the end. So the next one, a little bit of a spoiler there, sorry.
It's okay.
So there are only 7 chapters in the book, and 5 of them are absent from this film. Including the law of Club and Fang, the dominant primordial beast, who has won the mastership, and the toil of trace and trail, as well as the first chapter into the primitive. So next one is it's become a romance, right? The fabled lost mine and its ramshackle cabin, which appear in the last chapter of the book, are identified early on in the movie and used to provide the motivation for the characters, who are all looking for the claim. Ironically, they all find it too. It's fun. But yeah, see, here is Ty's pink. It's that same polka dot tie. In need of money for their equipment, Thornton boasts that Buck can pull 1,000 pounds. This classic scene is one of the few in the book set inside a saloon. In this film, however, more time is spent inside saloons than in the wild. So, next one. This is the famous thing. We all know Buck breaks out the sled loaded with half a ton of flour and pulls it 100 yards as everyone in Dawson City cheers. Although Buck risks his life for Thornton's on more than one occasion in the book, he jumps over a cliff at Thornton's command and he saves Thornton's life in a nasty stretch of rapids. Those scenes are not included in the film. It is Buck's winning of a bet for Thornton that entertains the crowds. Thus, the carnivorous animal described by London as overspilling with vigor and vitality is depicted sentimentally as John Thornton's devoted sled dog. This is what Hollywood does to great literature. Shorty, Thornton, and Claire Blake now have the money they need for their equipment. The three of them leave Dawson to find Old Man Blake's claim. Buck accompanies them, although you would never guess it from these lobby cards. So the next one. They find the cabin and lots of gold. Shorty heads back to Dawson to file their claim, and Buck begins to answer the call of the wild, dramatized only by his howling when he hears wolves howling.
So the literal call.
Yes, next one. And that is one way that you can interpret it in the book. It is the call of the wolves that he hears. So meanwhile, Claire, Mrs. John Blake that is, and John Thornton fall in love. The bad guys show up, take the gold dust on the table, and then drown on their way to register a claim. Okay, next one. At the end, Claire is reunited with her husband, John Blake, and they go off to file their claim. Thornton stays behind to work the mine. Meanwhile, Buck responds to the howling wolves, but it would be a gross exaggeration to say that he goes feral, because unlike the book, there is no frame set up to indicate he is predisposed to answering the call of the wild. Instead, his human master gives him permission to go. Thompson says to him, quote, "It's hard to say no to that call, isn't it? It's okay. Boy, go ahead." The film cuts to springtime, and we see Buck and a she-wolf nestled in the woods with a litter of half-wolf, half-St. Bernard puppies. Jack Oakey was scripted to be killed at the end, and this ending was originally filmed. However, at a preview of the film in Los Angeles, viewers would not accept Oakey's death. A new ending, keeping Oakey alive, was then shot before the film was released nationally. In the revised ending, it just gets worse. Shorty returns victorious, having beaten the Blakes and staking their claim. And he brings a First Nation woman with him, whom he won in a crap game. Our new cook, he informs them. And that's the end.
Oh God. So, as you can see, this adaptation of London is, well, I go on about the call and the howl and, well, that's probably enough
That was painful.
of talking. Yeah, so that's good. So, we have a little time.
Yeah, why don't you guys both come back up here and then my class can pepper you with questions.
Okay.
Pepper away.
Sound good to you guys? Should I leave the picture up in the background? Yeah? Good backdrop?
Yeah, if you thought Jack London was a racist, Hollywood.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any questions, guys?
This is kind of a really general question, but so I was reading about naturalist literature, and you said there's kind of like a new wave of naturalist literature. was the first wave more like closer to like naturalist philosophy where things are depicted as, it's like almost like hyper-realism,
Ah,
like less allegorical?
well, I think the earliest naturalism that sort of came out of realism, and it brought into realism basically a belief in evolution, understanding of Darwinism, and that entailed the idea that there's what do they call it? There's no free will. Everything is determined, and so the you know, in the dog with the instinct, that would be the dog doesn't have any say. It's, you know, the senses that tell him there's the news in the land, and people go about their life trying to make decisions and do good things, but they don't really, they believe, they don't really see the larger picture, the forces that are really acting on them. So, you could say that Buck as an animal is being acted on by forces that he doesn't understand. You wanna add something to that?
Yeah, I'd agree. That the earlier, I don't know if there are two ways of naturalism. There might be
There are a lot of ways, I think. I mean, almost every writer had their own little take.
or waves.
Ways.
So maybe there's kind of a modern naturalism. And some people think Cormac McCarthy and other writers are kind of naturalist writers. But I agree with Susan's characterization. You have kind of a reversal of romantic literature from the turn of the 19th century, and the reversal is called realism, an attention to daily life and an attention to kind of a photographic representation of reality. So William Dean Howells is a principal exponent of realism. And so, and he tried to report relations, say, between men and women as they actually were, right? So his work then later became characterized as teacup reality, because he went into homes and reported what a husband would say to his wife as the wife brought the teacups to the table. And it was very important for literature to reach that stage, because before that you had Melville and Hawthorne and to some extent Twain. It's a danger to characterize and pigeonhole every writer, but in general that's true. So London, Frank Norris, Stephen Crane, writers like that took that realism and thought about how to represent reality in as great detail as possible, and then played with those notions, and then, as Susan said, interjected new philosophical ideas, and not just Darwin, but also new psychology, with an understanding. I mean, sexology started to develop around the turn of the century, which Freud and Jung all came out of, right? And so also the sexual instinct became one of these forces that drives us apparently against our will, right? So, and then physical forces, they're becoming, think about Einstein. Einstein was writing in the early 1900s. So there was this understanding of what is light and what is the material world, right? So by taking those philosophical approaches and incorporating them into the fiction, kind of rendered realism into something else that we call naturalism.
And so, do you think this naturalism was like a reaction to the Industrial Revolution? And you said there's like a trend.
Politically speaking, because one of the forces then that was, and especially in London's work, and I think you can read Call of the Wild as a critique of American capitalism, right? So one of the forces and one of the new thinkers, you have Freud, Darwin, and Marx happening all at about the same time. And if look at today, who do we have today that equals the brain power of those thinkers, right? Ways to systematically understand the world, the entire world at large. We can understand the world biologically, says Darwin. We can understand the world sexually, says Freud. We can understand the world economically, as Marx said. These are all radical ideas at the time that London's writing. So, what was
And
your
they're all part of scientific materialism.
Right, exactly.
It's bringing this kind of, the early naturalists, Émile Zola in France, thought he was being scientific. And he would take characters and put them in a situation, and then, you know, people would observe how they reacted. And it was supposed to be scientific, it was like an experiment. And actually, who did, my blank on it, Madame Bovary,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Flaubert. Flaubert was considered the master craftsman of every sentence was a masterpiece. And if you've seen the story or the movie, there's one scene where there's like a county fair. That's what it would be today. And so there's a grandstand that has bunting around it, and then these local magistrates, you know, people come and they make their little speeches. And so Flaubert wrote a scene in the novel, and then the next day, the little village agricultural fair took place, and the people came, and the little politicians and magistrates, and gave their speeches, and that was his test. He said it was almost word for word what he had written the night before, because that was the test, that he understood the things they would say and the way they would express themselves. And so that was considered a test. Reality was the test, and the fiction had to be as close to it as possible.
Do you think Joyce was a naturalist?
Joyce, oh, I don't know.
That's what I was wondering.
Certainly not in terms of structure or style or the way that he juxtaposes chapters. So Joyce is commonly known as a modernist or a high modernist, and more. World War I was a radical break in literary understanding. So before World War, and it's a pity that London died in 1916, right at the brink of World War I. So you would want to see how would London respond to, because London was a voracious reader. So how would London have responded to Joyce and T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, all the great novelists, all the great modernists of the 20s, to Fitzgerald and Hemingway, and it's my feeling is that he would have really done what they had done. At the same time, he read Henry James, who was his contemporary, and couldn't stomach it. It was just so completely different. So it'd be a good argument, definitely. But Joyce as a naturalist, no, I don't think so. It's something, he's something beyond that, or apart from that, maybe.
Did London write more stories like in reference to the apostate with child labor, sweatshops kind of thing? Did he write any more stories like that?
The Mexican,
Yeah,
those
yeah, absolutely.
Dream of Debs, maybe.
Right. Yeah.
He does have in 1905, he went on a tour across the country, mainly out to the East Coast, and to talk about socialism to college students, because there was a group of pretty influential people at the time who formed the International Collegiate Society, and they picked London to be their spokesman, because they said all of these really bright and wealthy young people are in colleges where they're not learning anything about socialism, about contemporary politics. And London was, such a charismatic speaker. So he went all over. And when he came back, he started writing stories that some of the critics, all right, said, oh, these were socialist stories, and that they didn't like that because they were sort of middle class professors and critics who didn't really understand. You know, it's like socialism. You know, they didn't understand what he was. That was a critique of society, and but I think well, I talked to you about Apostate. I think it's one of his greatest stories, and it's interesting to me that some of these best stories have been kind of dumped in favor of London the Adventurer, you know, London the fabulous dog stories, and you know, when that's really, if you include all of his nonfiction writing for journals and the newspaper along with his fiction, you know, that image of him is really just such a small little part. But that's what, almost to the exclusion of everything else, is in America how we think of London. And he's much, I think I told you, he's much more popular in other countries outside of the United States because they don't see him that way. They read more of his work. They see him as much more diverse kind of a writer.
I don't think there's a story he wrote, and South of the Slot is another one.
Yep.
I don't think there's a story he wrote where he treats a worker ironically or without understanding or sympathy. The proletariat in London's work, all through his career, is treated sympathetically. And the capitalist class, the 1%, is treated as if they were the most evil characters in American society, basically.
Bernie Sanders is depicting him today.
Exactly. I'm glad you showed the cover, the cover of the first edition of Call of the Wild, right? Remember, it's three dogs.
Go back.
Right there in the beginning.
Yeah, three dogs going this way, three dogs going this way, three dogs going this way, right? And the dogs all are in the traces of a sled, right? Mm-hmm. Pretty much all of them. A couple have their heads up, but most of them have their heads down, and they look exhausted. And in the final panel, there's a man standing there with a club, right? Right? They've got that dog looks whipped. This dog looks whipped. This dog looks whipped. This dog's like, please stop beating me. This one's like, this one's like, okay, I can take some more. And that one's just, you know. This is a picture of the worker's life in America, right? And this drawing was done without London's input or influence, but obviously the illustrator had read the book and immediately picked up on one of the central messages of the book.
So do you think Jack London's infatuation with like the subject of nature was because there's kind of like a natural meritocracy, whereas his culture was one that had failed to be one?
Well, I think that's the big attraction and charm of his Yukon fiction, is everything is life or death. You know, there's no mistake. And death is a real life possibility. The climate is hostile to individuals, to life. And it's the white silence. It wants to just, you know, and his message usually is to survive in that kind of a world. It doesn't matter if you're a trust fund baby and you have all the money in the world, it won't help you at all. You know, you have to live by your wits. And you have other human beings. You have to rely on each other and help each other out, which is how you get through and how you make it. And that's also part of the idea of socialism, you know, is that we're all in it together and we have to help each other out, not take advantage of each other. And yeah, but I think it's that life or death. Everything is, you know, if you screw up, you're dead. So everything's on there, you know?
And it usually happens in a cabin. And it usually happens going after gold.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I want to get rich. Let's go get gold.
Right, and look at thousands and thousands and thousands of people, you know, sold the farm and, you know, mortgaged anything they could to go up there from.
In 1897.
Yes, yeah, look at the founding of California. It was the gold rush, really, that brought people by the thousands in here,
Including Charmaine's father.
including Charmaine's father, handsome, dashing Captain Kittredge.
I don't know if I'd call nature a meritocracy or not. I'm not sure about that. It's definitely worthy of exploration. I mean, there's an anti-civilization impulse in London. Like, just because everyone has a veneer of a civilized being, but underneath is your real self, right? So, and in that sense, everyone is the same. There's kind of a natural inherent democracy in human society because we're all the same. Yeah, there's that point. And then also, it's important to remember for London, biology, and then you were talking about, biology trumps everything in London's understanding. It trumps politics, everything, every other mode of being, because it takes us to the elemental, which is what the Colorado could be read is all about, right? It's all about the primordial.
So you're saying, in a way, even in nature, you still inherit certain advantages and disadvantages, so it's still not a true paradox.
Right, exactly. And it's all the chain of, you know, the little fish is eaten by this, like the bigger fish is eaten by,
The
and
top of
that's,
the pile is the biggest predator.
Yeah.
Around here in the mountain line.
yeah.
Did
And,
you guys, oh, I'm sorry.
no, go ahead.
I was gonna ask you to, talk maybe a little bit about the scene, in chapter 4, the first appearance of the the caveman, as Buck, sees a vision of the caveman at the fire. The class was struck by that image and how it, as we know, later reappears. Why do you think, don't you think that would have been shocking for the audience that read it, when the book came out? And why do you think, I understand allegorically why it's there, but talk a little bit about why he put that in there. Why do you think?
Well, I was gonna say before about naturalism that one of the main tenets was atavism. And London really buys into that big. And so the idea is that when you strip off the layers of civilization and your primordial person, he believed you can get back in touch with these memories of earlier generations. And so that's what he's, I think, trying to show with Buck, is that, you know, he's not just prancing around in the snow, he's carrying all of this information, this experience that all of the progenitors, all the generations of dogs that have led up to him are in there. And London thought we did too, that we could, when we were in if you were in the Yukon and you were horny, you would hightail it over to the closest Indian camp, and then you would pick out, inevitably, the chief's daughter, and you would want to take her away with you, but there was always, inevitably, one of the young bucks who already had his eye on her. And so the southern white man this is the plot of most of those Yukon stories, you know, would have to duke it out. And when he says it's like 19,000 years of civilization fell off of him, and he's out there battling, you know, and so London was really into this whole idea. And I think that he's trying to, that's exactly what, that Buck has that, and so he can harken back. And it's also, you know, it's the Hulk, if you ever saw that, you know, Superman, really. You know, anybody that does a transformation
Yeah, just as humans, that's why, I mean, you can read it allegorically or not. You know, it's both beast and human who come from the primordial ooze, right? London had a very primitive understanding of DNA and how information from past generations moves along through generations, right? But because he was an artist, he didn't really understand how that worked, right? right, how traits are passed. Either do I, really, but I'm a humanist, not a scientist. But London kind of substituted our modern understanding of DNA with an artistic understanding. So that's like the call of the wild is that kind of process of going back in time and remembering where you came from and who you really are, right? So, so there's that, right? So, and it's true for humans and it's true for dogs. They kind of, and presumably for other living beings as well.
Well, I think a lot
And
of
that's
London's
and
stories-
the epigraph to the novel, that quatrain that begins the book,
That's-
it is all about that,
Yeah,
right?
it's the title of the poem.
Right. Yeah. And
Why do you think he included that?
well, it comes from a newspaper, right? So if you knew that, right?
If he only knew that.
He would have read that and he would have realized, oh my God, if I go north, I'll become this. But he didn't read newspaper.
Good, good. Last chance for questions, guys. They can't answer questions outside of Call of the Wild too, if you have one quick question about your topic that you're writing about.
I'm writing about naturalism and I guess the evolution of American literature. So this kind of it's a little off topic, but when you were at Amherst, were you there when David Foster Wallace was there?
No.
Okay. Because it's interesting because he's known for being like really postmodern and like structurally really weird writer, but he cites like Norris's Critique and Zola, and he likes Cormac McCarthy along with Gaddis and Finch and all of them too.
Yep.
And he does have like sort of a battle against irony and breaking down the third wall or whatever. So that wasn't really a question.
London wrote a couple of book reviews, and one of the book reviews he wrote was of Frank Norris's the first volume in the Weed trilogy.
The
title-
fifth?
Yeah, I think it was the fifth. No, the one that came before.
So you wrote,
The Octopus.
I feel like I was there now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so he admires Norris's work, but he complains that Norris is, it's like there's a scene in The Octopus where the character is opening a safe and Norris says, and the numbers, and he spun the dial to 36, 8, 25 or whatever. And London's like, oh my God, why do we need to know the numbers that he turned to? The details are not important. So this was kind of a blending of realism and naturalism. London looked for the emotion that you got from reading, whereas Norris and other naturalists and realists were really interested in exact representation. There were 36 chairs in this classroom, and there were 2 people in front. And London would have just said, and the class erupted in laughter and enjoyment, or something like that.
Well,
And Foster Wallace, I mean, my God, the attention to detail, the footnoting is crazy, right? Yeah.
But I think people talk about London as an idealist and a naturalist, right?
They do.
And I was thinking that because he's not, he always has that emotion and that idealism, and I think in Call of the Wild, you see he has the brutality of Buck's adaptation to the wilderness, but, at the end, we have this, glorious paean to individualism, he's running free at the head of the pack, and, it's like, there's, that's why it's not strictly naturalistic in any sense. And usually you find that kind of contradiction in London's works, both,
Both work at the same time, yeah.
because, and I think, he did struggle hard to get himself out of the lower working class, by hard work, by reading, by, and he understood that everybody couldn't do it, that he was special, but he experienced what it was to be down and out, and also the drive and the ambition to rise above it, and to exhilarate, you know, and want that success and individualism.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. So lucky to have you come to our class. Thank you so much for coming. Guys, don't forget to check Blackboard later today. You will see your outline assignment posted there. I apologize for not bringing it today to class. And details about the questions